December 31st, 2019. Osaka. A private jet lifts off from Kansai International Airport and enters the night sky above Japan. On the manifest, the aircraft is carrying audio equipment, musical instruments, the kind of cargo that moves through customs with the bored efficiency of a routine commercial inspection. Nobody opens every case. Nobody checks every box. Nobody asks why a crate this large is booked on a flight to Istanbul. Inside one of those crates, folded into a space roughly the dimensions of a large shipping container, is one of the most powerful executives in the history of the global automobile industry. He is 75 years old. He is wearing dark clothes. He is breathing through air holes. And he is, officially, legally, formally, a fugitive. Think about that for a second. Not the crate, not the logistics of it, though we'll get to that. Think about the distance between where Carlos Ghosn started and where he ended up, curled in the dark above the Pacific, fleeing a country that had treated his arrest like a national corrective, and his detention like a warning to every foreign executive who had ever looked at Japan's corporate culture and decided the old rules didn't apply to him. The distance between those 2 points is the entire story, and it is, depending on where you're standing, either the story of a man who escaped justice or the story of a man who survived it. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. Carlos Ghosn was born in Brazil, raised in Lebanon, educated in France. He was trilingual before he was remarkable, and he became remarkable very quickly. At Michelin, he turned around a struggling North American operation that nobody else wanted. At Renault, he cut costs with a precision that earned him a nickname, the cost killer. That was meant to be derisive and became instead a credential. The man who could look at a company bleeding money and find, with almost surgical calm, exactly where the bleeding was happening and how to stop it. Not a diplomat, not a consensus builder, a diagnostician. In 1999, Renault sent him to Nissan. And here is where the story gets complicated in all the ways that matter. Because before we talk about what he allegedly took, we have to understand what he genuinely built. You cannot skip that part. The crime, if it is a crime, only makes sense inside the achievement. The achievement is what made the crime possible. They are not two separate stories. They are the same story, told twice, from opposite ends of the same corridor. Nissan in 1999 was, by every measurable standard, dying. The company carried $21 billion in debt. It was losing market share across every major region. Morale was catastrophic. The management culture was layered and hierarchical and deeply resistant to exactly the kind of intervention that was the only thing that could save it. And the employees knew it was failing. They just couldn't figure out how to stop it. Into this situation walked a Brazilian-Lebanese-French executive who spoke no Japanese, understood the cultural architecture only academically, and arrived with a plan called the Nissan Revival Plan that called for closing factories, cutting 21,000 jobs, and eliminating the network of cross-shareholdings that had defined Japanese corporate relationships for generations. Everyone said it would fail. Everyone said Japan would reject him. Everyone said the culture was impenetrable, that the Keiretsu system was not a business arrangement but a social compact, and that no foreign executive had ever successfully dismantled one. Within 2 years, Nissan was profitable. Within 3, the debt was gone. Within 5, Ghosn was running both Nissan and Renault simultaneously, the first person in history to serve as CEO of 2 Fortune 500 companies at the same time. He was on the cover of everything. A manga comic book was written about him in Japan, lionizing his turnaround with the visual grammar of a superhero origin story. He was not merely admired, he was mythologized. And here's the thing, when you become a myth, the myth starts doing work that you no longer have to do yourself. The story of Carlos Ghosn, the cost killer, the turnaround artist, the man who broke through the walls of Japan Inc., became its own kind of collateral. Boards trusted him because the myth trusted him. Regulators deferred to him because the myth had a track record. The compensation packages grew. The perks accumulated. The private jets and the corporate apartments and the elaborate personal arrangements that would eventually become the architecture of his prosecution were all, at some level, made possible by a story that had become too large and too useful to examine too closely. And here's the thing about myth. It doesn't just protect you from scrutiny, it actively repels it. The people inside the boardroom who might have raised a hand and asked a question about the Beirut apartment, or the Rio property, or the retirement agreement that was drafted but never filed, those people had watched Carlos Ghosn pull a dying company back from the abyss with his bare hands. You don't interrogate that man about receipts. You don't ask that man to justify his expense reports. The trust was institutional. And institutional trust is the most dangerous kind because it is distributed across everyone and owned by no one, which means when it fails, nobody is responsible for the failure. In 2018, the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi Alliance was the largest automobile group in the world by volume, selling more cars than Toyota, more than Volkswagen. The alliance that Ghosn had spent nearly 2 decades building was, by any reasonable measure, one of the great achievements of modern corporate history. On November 19, 2018, Carlos Ghosn boarded his private jet in Beirut and flew to Tokyo. He was arrested on the tarmac by Japanese prosecutors before the plane had fully stopped moving. The charges were financial. Prosecutors alleged that Ghosn had underreported his compensation to Japanese securities regulators by approximately $80 million over a period of roughly 8 years, deferring salary to avoid the reporting thresholds, structuring the payments through retirement agreements that were never formally disclosed. There were additional allegations that he had used Nissan funds to purchase personal residences in Beirut, Rio de Janeiro, Paris, and Amsterdam, that he had arranged for a Saudi businessman to funnel payments through a Nissan dealership to cover personal financial losses, that he had, in other words, treated one of the most valuable automotive companies in the world as a mechanism for his own comfort and enrichment. The word they kept using in Tokyo was misconduct. Systematic, sustained, carefully hidden misconduct. And the precision with which the evidence had been assembled. Internal emails, financial records, draft agreements that had been pulled from servers inside Nissan made clear that whoever built the case had been inside the walls when they did it. This was not a regulatory investigation that started from the outside and worked its way in. This was a detonation that started at the center and worked its way out. The question of who lit the fuse, and why and when, would shadow every subsequent proceeding. You're probably thinking someone should have caught this earlier. And you'd be right. Several people inside Nissan had. The question of who built the case against him, and why, and when. That question has never been fully resolved, and the ambiguity is part of the story's permanent unease. Because here is what happened next. Ghosn was arrested, and then he stayed arrested. Japanese criminal procedure is not American criminal procedure. In Japan, a suspect can be detained for 23 days without charge. That period can be extended repeatedly by the courts. Ghosn was held for 130 days before his first release on bail. A bail that came with conditions so restrictive that legal scholars in multiple countries cited them as extraordinary by any international standard. No private meetings with his wife Carol. Internet access monitored and limited. Security cameras installed at his home. His passport confiscated, obviously. And then, in April 2019, rearrested. New charges. Detention again. The Japanese legal system, which convicts more than 99% of the defendants who reach trial, was doing what it does. Building methodically toward a verdict that, in Japan, almost always goes one direction. Ghosn maintained, from the beginning, that he was the victim of a coup. That the charges were assembled by Nissan executives who feared he was moving too aggressively toward full merger with Renault. A merger that would have transferred meaningful control of the alliance to the French company, and which certain Japanese executives and, some have argued, elements of the Japanese government were determined to prevent. He was not, in his telling, a criminal. He was a threat to corporate sovereignty, taken off the board by the institutions he had built. If you want to subscribe, right now is the time. Because what comes next is the part that sounds like it was written by someone who'd had too much to drink and access to a thriller novelist. The plan involved his wife, a former Green Beret, a private security company, and several large musical instrument cases. The operational details emerged slowly through subsequent legal proceedings and investigations in multiple countries, but the essential structure was this. A team of former American Special Operations soldiers, contracted through a private security firm run by a man named Michael Taylor and his son Peter, traveled to Japan in late December 2019. They moved in and out of the country, scouting exits. On New Year's Eve, Gosen left his house under surveillance, traveling ostensibly to attend a small social gathering. He did not return. At Osaka's Kansai airport, a private jet was booked under a charter arrangement. The instrument cases, large, professional, the kind that move through airports without attracting unusual scrutiny, were loaded as cargo. Gosen, by every subsequent account, climbed inside one of them. The jet departed for Istanbul. From Istanbul, a second aircraft departed for Beirut. By the time Japanese authorities realized what had happened, he was in Lebanon. Lebanon has no extradition treaty with Japan. Lebanon is also, not incidentally, the country of Gosen's heritage, the country where his extended family lives, the country whose government was never, even in the most diplomatic terms, going to hand him back. He appeared on camera in Beirut in January 2020. He was composed. He was articulate. He said he had escaped a justice system that had no presumption of innocence, that offered no meaningful right to a fair trial, that used pretrial detention as a tool of coercion rather than a measure of public safety. He said the charges against him were a collusion between Nissan executives and Japanese prosecutors. He said he was not fleeing justice, he was fleeing injustice. And, yeah, he said it with the same unblinking certainty that had once convinced 21,000 Nissan employees that the factory closures were necessary and the recovery was possible. That had convinced Renault's board to hand him the reins of an entire automotive empire. That had, for nearly 2 decades, convinced every room he walked into that Carlos Ghosn was the most indispensable person in it. The press conference was extraordinary, not because of what he said. The legal arguments were coherent but rehearsed, the kind of defense that had clearly been crafted over many months of detention and reflection. What was extraordinary was the manner, the stillness, the total absence of the tremor you'd expect from a man who had just spent the last weeks of December hiding in a wooden box, crossing international borders as contraband, leaving behind his legal team, his bail conditions, and whatever remained of his standing before the global business community. He looked like a man who had won something, and in his own accounting, he had. The Taylors, Michael and Peter, were subsequently arrested in the United States and extradited to Japan in 2021, where they pled guilty to helping a criminal suspect escape and served prison sentences. No one else directly involved in the operation has faced criminal consequences. Ghosn himself remains in Beirut, giving interviews, writing memoirs, speaking at conferences, living in a large house in one of Beirut's wealthier neighborhoods. A free man, by one definition, and a fugitive by all the legal ones that still apply everywhere except the country he's standing in. Drop a comment below. Do you think Carlos Ghosn was a criminal who escaped or a scapegoat who survived? Because that question has a different answer depending entirely on who you ask. And almost everyone has an answer. What the story leaves behind is not a clean moral. The Japanese legal system's treatment of his detention was widely criticized by human rights organizations. The structural questions about the alliance, who had what to gain from his removal, who assembled the evidence and why, who knew about the compensation arrangements and looked away until it was useful to stop looking. Those questions were never fully answered in court because there was never a trial. And Nissan, the company he rescued from the edge of collapse, the company that generated the case against him, is once again struggling. Market share declining. Leadership instability. The turnaround that made him a myth, slowly unraveling without the man who authored it. The compensation was real. The underreporting was, by the accounting of every independent financial analysis, real. The personal use of corporate assets was real. The man lived on a scale that required institutional support to maintain. The apartments, the parties, the personal logistics of a life constructed for someone who had decided somewhere along the way that the rules were a framework for other people. That much seems settled. And yet, the arrest on the tarmac, the 130 days of detention, the conditions of bail that barred him from speaking to his wife, the rearrest on new charges the moment the first bail was posted, the 99% conviction rate. The fact that the internal Nissan investigation was conducted by a law firm that also represented the executives who stood to benefit most from his removal. None of that is clean. The Taylors are out of Japanese prison now. Gosen is in Beirut, unreachable. The box he climbed into at Kansai Airport, the audio equipment crate, the instrument case, whatever it was exactly, has become the symbol the story deserved. A man of enormous power and genuine achievement, folded into the smallest possible space, breathing through air holes above the Pacific, having decided that the system that made him was now the thing he needed to escape. He built the largest car alliance in the world. He dismantled a corporate culture that nobody believed could be dismantled. He earned the manga. He earned the magazine covers. He also, somewhere in the long arc of unchecked authority and institutional deference and the particular blindness that attaches itself to the very powerful, appears to have helped himself to things that were not his. The system that failed to catch him early. The system that then caught him all at once. The system he then escaped. It is still running. The cars are still being made. The alliance is still nominally in place, held together now by contractual obligation more than shared vision. Its three members, Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi, negotiating with each other across a table that has never fully recovered from the earthquake of November 2018. The boardrooms are still full of men who believe, with the total confidence that only genuine past achievement can produce, that they understand exactly where the lines are, that they are not that guy, that their judgment is sufficiently good, their integrity sufficiently secure to operate at the scale of power they now occupy without the guardrails that exist for lesser people. Carlos Ghosn believed that too. For most of his career, he had evidence to support it. That is, in the end, what makes the story so resistant to easy conclusion. He was right about himself, until he wasn't. And by the time anyone could tell the difference, the myth had already done its work. Somewhere in Beirut, a 75-year-old man is sitting in a house he cannot leave without risking extradition, conducting interviews, insisting on his innocence, waiting for a world that has mostly moved on to remember that the story isn't over. The box is empty now. But the question it contained, about power and oversight, and what we choose not to see in the people we have decided to believe, that question traveled with him, crossed every border, landed without a visa, and has not yet been answered. It probably won't be.